Well, good evening, everyone. This is Mel here from Seeker's Corner. I'm going to be discussing AJ Deus's latest paper. I'm not going to be covering everything. I'm just going to focus on one particular theme in it, which is the question of the Dome of the Rock. When was it built? When were the inscriptions put there? And so on. So, probably a good enough place to start would be to start with his discussion about the coins, a little bit of a background, and then we'll get into the evidence in relation to the Dome of the Rock and the rock inscriptions that are meant to be there from the beginning. Okay, so he says here that Muawiyah removed the crossbar top right, as you can see in the picture, but maintained the mutilated chiro that appears to be Heraclius insignia, perhaps meaning Pontifex Heraclius Imperator. Okay, so you can probably see it here if I bring the cursor over here, just here. Okay, it's kind of like a H there for the Heraclius, perhaps. Okay. Now he refers to this shape here as the shape of the staff of Moses. He says the final shape of the staff of Moses was not yet found, and it cannot be excluded that Muawiyah meant to use the Egyptian Tau cross, St. Anthony's cross, for its symbolism. Of course, Muawiyah also issued coins with crosses. Okay, so he's making the argument that that is what the shape is here in this coin here. It's a staff of Moses. It's an interesting theory. I think he's probably right, particularly if you compare that side of the coin with the figures on the other side who are holding staff, so it would seem to suggest that. I have another idea that it might be to do it as well, which I'll share with you a little later. But I do think probably AJ Deus's idea is probably more correct and more likely than my idea. Abd al Malik turned the top bar into a bud of global significance, so that you see that little round bit on the top of the staff. The bud. Okay. Would it be reasonable to assume that these coins do not refer to Prophet Muhammad of the traditions, but rather to the one alive, Muhammad ibn al-Hanifa from the house of Ali? A reference to Prophet Muhammad of the traditions on these coins is mere conjecture. So I think that's a reasonable conclusion. The changes in iconography on coins also indicate that the doctrines of Proto-Islam were still under development. That the imprint may relate to the present time messenger can be corroborated with a Khazar coin from the 820s, which says, Moses is the messenger of God, Musa Rasul Allah. It's not coincidental that Musa was the seventh Imam of 12-verse Shiism at the time. From this follows the logic that X is the pontiff of Islam. I think that's an excellent point there. But first, the Al-Aqsa Mosque. Since there was no mosque on the Temple Mount until at least 639, as a Muslim, Prophet Muhammad of the traditions could not possibly have referred to the Temple Mount as its location. In other words, either the Al-Aqsa Mosque was somewhere else, or the related verses were changed or composed post-mortem. The paradox taints the night journey to the foundation stone in the Dome of the Rock and the change of the Qibla, which in and by itself is another mystery. The Qibla would not have been the Al-Aqsa Mosque, but the foundation stone in the Dome of the Rock. Even if traditions were not trying to fool us, to call upon the furthest mosque, Al-Haram, when the dream was to stand upon the Temple Mount seems not logical. If anything, it would have been the closest and the most important mosque before the Qibla change. The Al-Aqsa Mosque is not subject of this paper, but when the Quran talks about this house of prayers, it better be standing. Without it being known and referred to as Al-Aqsa Mosque, the Quran cannot have spoken about it unless it had Nehemiah bin Huziel's Jewish temple adventure of 614 to 617 in mind. Okay, so He goes on to say, Surah 2, it speaks of Beit, the house. In his article, The Original Islamic Hajj to Jerusalem, the philologist Robert Kerr noted that the noun Beit, or house, can also be used in the sense of a temple dedicated to a deity in the Semitic languages, often in a genitive compound, in the house of the Lord. Babet Yahweh, example Psalm 134:1. He adds that this cultic term actually always refers to the Jerusalem temple. Its use for an unknown, historically at best insignificant sanctuary far away in the Hijaz seems strange. Likewise, Rodwell's translation of the Quran also took Beit for temple, but he did not place it in Jerusalem. If that is correct, then Surah 2:153 rises to primary evidence. I'm aware of the disingenuous traditions about hills attached to Arab superstitions. It takes years of academic training not to see the primary evidence that is right in front of our eyes. The single difference in reading it properly is to replace painful rationalizations with a simple time shift to unlock the Quran in its context. Easy enough, another part requires deep learning of the Talmuds and their encoding mechanisms. Okay, so here it is. Let me put the primary evidence of the Quran over secondary narrators who serve nothing other than a hit job against history. Verily, Safa and Marwa are among the monuments of God. Whoever then maketh a pilgrimage to the temple or visit it shall not be to blame if he go around about them both. And as for him who of his own accord doeth what is good, God is grateful, knowing. Whatever happens in Jerusalem stays in Jerusalem, says AJ. Now, what's interesting, and I have to admit, I didn't notice this. It's a significant thing, and actually I'm going to highlight it here now. Is the word monuments. Okay. Now, why is that important? Well, we know that there was a mount called Marwa in Jerusalem. We know there's a mount called Safa, but they're not monuments. It takes a bit of twisting to say that they're monuments. Okay, so the borrowing of the words could have come from there, but you still have to find monuments. Really, that's the thing. And just reading in the context of that, it's a pilgrimage to the temple. It suggests that these are monuments on the Temple Mount itself. So there's a pilgrimage to the temple and the monuments are nearby. So it must be something distinct. So essentially it's not talking about the hill of Marwa, it's talking about a monument called Marwa. Okay, so these are kind of like their appropriate nicknames, if you like, for the monuments that are on these on the Temple Mount. Okay, that's what he's getting at. Now he explains it a lot better shortly. It has nothing to do with a place called Safa in Josephus' Antiquities. That this place Safa was then reached in a one-off procession to greet Alexander the Great. From it, Jerusalem and the Temple Mount can be overlooked. In the invented double dream tale, Alexander had imagined about the high priest of the Jews, Jaddua, having prophesied success in subduing the Persians. The two met at the very spot. Before that, Jaddua had his own dream in which his god suggested to welcome Alexander after he had already deserted from Persia. A perpetual motif of shifting alliances within the Judeo-Messianic thought framework. So there's a motif there in association with Safa about shifting alliances. Okay, so that's the inspiration for calling one of the monuments Safa. Now, the other one, likewise Mount Moriah, or the Temple Mount, is not Mount Marwa. That's what he says. Okay. Based on conjecture, researchers have long suspected on the wrong basis that Safa and Marwa must be in Jerusalem. Now, he's not saying they aren't in Jerusalem, but he's saying on the wrong basis. they have been overcomplicating things. The verses do not talk about places, but about monuments, and both must be near the temple. If the Marwa monument were Mount Moriah, then the temple in the verse would logically be redundant. So again, he's talking about monuments. Now, written between 692 and 700 AD, the Surah legitimizes the pilgrimage to and circumambulation around two Umayyad monuments in Jerusalem, Safa and Marwa. Okay, so this is very specific in terms of the dating here. Now, what are Safa and Marwa? They are a Sufyanid and a Marwanid structure on the Temple Mount. As an apparent matter of agreement, both monuments are circumambulated as part of other monuments of the God of the Israelites and proto-Muslims, which is not possible with the Al-Aqsa Mosque. The reason for this acceptance is likely that Muhammad ibn al-Hanifa may have taken residence in Jerusalem, or that he was used to his headquarters somewhere else. This is potentially attested by mosques that are precisely oriented toward Jerusalem. Mecca as a primary destination is not implied here. What is understood, however, is that these structures were already standing and not yet to be built, something that could with certainty not be attributed to the time of Prophet Muhammad of the traditions, neither in Mecca nor in the Holy City, because he never conquered Jerusalem according to tradition. Attempting to reconcile this with tradition would require Islamic history to assimilate the events on the Temple Mount of 614 to 617 AD under Nehemiah bin Huziel as their own, and their own they are. The account of Safa and Marwa in Mecca conveniently appears with the first traditions after the Sufyanid structure was razed and the Marwanid synagogue turned into the Temple of Solomon. Okay? He says, I cannot stress this enough, Safa and Marwa is moved to Mecca precisely with the composition of the original traditions. So it happens simultaneously. Alright, so when was that? That would have been sometime in the early 8th century. So these two monuments were wiped. The Safa and Marwa boulders, essentially, which are in Mecca, were established. They picked two locations, and those became the Safa and Marwa monuments there. Okay, so that makes a lot of sense. The temple in the surah appears to be a third structure, and that is possibly the little temple that had been mentioned in the 630s, or likely a new building, possibly over the foundation stone, commissioned by Muhammad ibn al-Hanifa. I'm not sure if I'd necessarily agree with him. I think it probably makes more sense to identify it with what Umar had built, but we'll go with that for now. This temple could also have become the tomb of Muhammad, the messenger of God from Kufa. Now, isn't that interesting? Because that is a claim that I made earlier. It's a bit spooky. So this temple could have also become the tomb of Muhammad, the messenger of God from Kufa. Now, Kufa and Hira are the same thing. So I think he's hitting on a few points that we in Sneakers Corner have made over the last couple of years. It's interesting, he's coming to similar conclusions, which was, according to inadmissible tradition and Jewish custom, also circumambulated. Now, when he refers to inadmissible tradition, he's basically saying, this is something that is said in the standard Islamic narrative, but we're not using that as evidence, so that's why he's calling it inadmissible. It may be the cause for the large-scale construction attested to this time. However, later reports appear to refer to the Marwanid structure being a synagogue situated in the north of the Temple Mount. Okay. It is fascinating that the Sufyanid and Marwanid Umayyads maintained two different monuments on the Temple Mount, both of which were circumambulated. Likewise, the followers of the Messenger refused to circumambulate any other structures than the ones associated with the house of Ali. Unless their faith base was distinct, this does not make sense. Hence, we will still need to figure out how the Sufyanids and the Marwanids are really related, but these two or three structures in Jerusalem would doom any attempt to ascribe the surah to Islam of the traditions. An interesting little detail here, which I will highlight, is the Syriac Chronicle of Disasters from 716 AD tells us that Al-Walid I assembled all the treasure of the Saracens, hoarding it and putting it into a single treasury in Jerusalem, the holy city, which people say is the center of the earth. Now, how does that tally with the idea that Mecca was the center at that time? So it tells us that Jerusalem was still the epicenter of the Umayyad rulers, and that they saw themselves as the house of David. Okay, so obviously Jerusalem is referred to as the city of David. Now, what's interesting is the year 716. Okay, so that's a good source because it's contemporary with Walid I. We move on to the meat and bones of the discussion. Evidence of absence for the Dome of the Rock. So this is really an amazing piece of work that AJ Deus has done. It's really made me rethink a lot of the assumptions I had been making. And it's presented evidence I haven't seen before. So I think it's well worth taking our time to go through this. So an overview is perhaps timely to lay down the broad strokes of how the structures on the Temple Mount came to be in the first place. While some of it may sound unfamiliar to many, the two papers, Doctrina Jacobi, The Deceiver's Deception, and Jacob and Justice, lay out the big picture. In 609 AD, Khosrow promoted a new vassal king, Elijah bar Kapsha, chief of the Tayyi. Now you probably will maybe recognize the name Elijah bar Kapsha. That is the Hebrew version of Es ibn Kapisa. Es ibn Kapisa is the Arabic version of this. So he actually considers him also to be a key figure, as do I. And it's interesting, I came to that conclusion independently of AJ Deus. Discovering it not long after I had made the same discovery. The latter seems to have promised to realign the Southern Alliance into a pact against Byzantine Orthodox advances. This created a vassal kingdom that stretched from Al-Hira to the Red Sea, larger than the tribal alliances of Lakhmids and Ghassanids combined, with a massive trained army. This alliance led to the near collapse of the Byzantine Empire. From the context, the Persian obligation of the deal was likely an independent state that included Jerusalem. After Jewish forces captured Jerusalem in 614 AD, Nehemiah ben Huziel and Benjamin of Tiberias were able to rededicate the Temple Mount between 614 and 617 AD. Given that they were undoubtedly Jews, it's certain that their focal point would have been the foundation stone, and a little temple would have been built over it. For that purpose, the mount would have had to be purified, cleaned of any non-Jewish objects. Khosrow must have realized that he fell for a messianic deception. He faced Hadrian's choice. Now, what is Hadrian's choice? Hadrian originally had been lenient on the Jews, and then afterwards he changed his mind and realized what their intentions were to kick out the Romans and so on. So he as it says here, he reversed course, persecuted Jews, sided with Egyptian Christianity, and ended the alliance with Kapsha's Tayyi. Okay. Whatever was happening on the Temple Mount was extinguished. This triggered a massive wave of Jewish refugees in all quadrants, We do not know whether the little temple survived, but it is not probable. Capsia or his successor then likely sided with Heraclius, forging an alliance and declaring independence in 622 AD. Okay, so that had been my idea as well. Now, I know Red Judaism disagreed on that one, but AJ Deus certainly did agree, did come to the same conclusion. No longer a vassal, Capsia's state was born as a large Jewish nation enforced by refugees. Heraclius and Capsia's combined forces then obliterated the Persian Empire. Okay, so that was key. But Heraclius, triumphant occupant of Jerusalem, now faced Hadrian's choice. He force converted Benjamin of Tiberias circa 629 AD and commanded all Jews of the Byzantine Empire to be baptized to demonstrate their loyalty to him. He did not trust the Messianic alliance. This triggered a second wave of Jewish refugees. So in both cases, this distrust of the Jews was what led to the turnaround. Okay, it led to the deliberate creation of a new religion under the likely leadership of Abu Bakr's father, and a greater Jewish alliance under Capsia's Taye, or his successor, to oppose and subvert Byzantine Christianity and to ruin Heraclius' aspirations. The operation succeeded, and the saviour Umar, the anointed one from the house of Ali, was able to start construction on the Temple Mount in 639 AD, possibly avoiding the foundation stone under agreement of the Doctrina Jacobi. Right? The house of Joseph soon thereafter kicks the house of Ali out of the Temple Mount circa 644 AD. One area that I'm not 100% clear on is what exactly AJ means by House of Joseph and the House of Ali. That's something that I will look into later. If you've any thoughts on that, please leave your comments below. I'm sure that will be helpful to follow this line of argument. It is believed that Muslim historians deliberately downplayed the extraordinary building over the foundation stone because Abbasids intended to belittle Umayyad achievements. However, a non-existing monument needs no downplaying. That the original buildings were still Jewish despite possible shallow efforts to pretend otherwise, however, would become a Muslim embarrassment the moment that Proto-Islam would emancipate itself from Judaism, its mother religion. There are several comments in Sophronius about the brutality of the Saracen incursions, as well as a note that a mosque, Mizjita, would have been under construction on top of the Temple Mount. And this is one that we've seen again. Now, what's interesting here, I'll read it, but I want you to note the use of the word dunghill there. The godless Saracens entered the holy city of Christ our Lord, Jerusalem, with the permission of God and in punishment for our negligence, which is considerable, and immediately proceeded in haste to the place which is called the capital. They took with them men, some by force, others by their own will, in order to clean that place, i.e. the dunghill, respectively the Temple Mount, and to build that cursed thing intended for their prayer, which they call a mosque. Merging concerns about its authenticity, this text is only part of a Gregorian translation, but is still considered contemporary. Since Sophronius died in 639 AD, it must have been one of his last experiences to be recorded. Sabius relates a similar story with a twist, where the Jews started building the temple on a pedestal at the site of the Holy of Holies, which is on top of the foundation stone, but were then thrown off by the Ishmaelites. Okay. And then he goes on to say that in relation to Sabius, while his timeline seems loose in some sections, he provides for cornerstones to understand it. However, his entire chapter not only appears as an unrelated afterthought, but it is also completely void of names and anchors to time. I find his allegation that the Jews built a temple elsewhere especially offensive. Where? Who was their leader? Worse, it reminds me of the Talmudic jealousy between Hasmoneans and Oniids over the right to the position of the high priest in Jerusalem, particularly in Minakoth. We should take it with caution. As Sabius continues to treat Jews and Ishmaelites as distinct, my impression is that he perceived the house of Joseph as Ishmaelites, in particular since they concentrated with the Taye during his lifetime, and the house of Ali as Jewish. Okay, so there's something to consider. So the house of Ali is Jewish, the house of Joseph as Ishmaelites. Certainly putting them together in one sentence is akin to a bad omen for them having to share the Temple Mount. We do not know that the Alid Umar's place on the Temple Mount was replaced with Muawiyah. If anything, it most likely refers to this change of ownership, but there is no primary evidence that puts a building over the foundation stone. Okay, so this is a key bit, and this actually questions something that I had maybe misunderstood. From a dominant Arl Colf's text, it can be inferred that the dome was neither standing nor under construction during the 670s. Well, that I would agree. The original prayer house in Jerusalem that had been built in the 630s was enlarged and used by the Saracens on top of Roman ruins. He says, in that famous place where once stood the magnificently constructed temple near the eastern wall, the Saracens now frequent a rectangular house of prayer, which they have built in a crude manner, constructing it from raised planks and large beams over some remains of rooms. This house can, as it is said, accommodate at least 3,000 people. Now, this here is where that would be located, not in the center, but over here. Our Colf's text makes no hint at the construction or existence of the dome. Originally, the Al-Aqsa Mosque must have been oriented towards the foundation stone, the white line in the right image. Okay. The only problem is that it was not there. The crude structure that stood near the eastern wall would probably have been orientated likewise. It would have been placed at the center line of a 90-degree angle to the eastern wall, red line, right image. So in other words, it would have been placed here, centered on the rock. To accommodate 3,000 worshippers, the house of prayer would have been at least 24,000 square feet, or 2,000 meters squared. Now, what's interesting, he says, Arculf mentions the Sufyanid structure of Surah 2 that was standing in the eastern part of the Temple Mount with ample space for the circumambulation, the red rectangle. Were the Sufyanids indeed trying to distance themselves by a mere few feet from Jewish ark rituals, as tradition suggests? Unfortunately, Arculf is silent about the beliefs that were attached to the prayer house. Since the Marwanids were yet to rule, their monument was yet to be built. Okay? So, what he's pointing out is that this here is the Sufyanid monument, one of the two monuments mentioned in Surah 2. What's missing is the Marwanid monument. Since the Marwanids were yet to rule, the monument was yet to be built. To get a better handle of the time's context, I point out that Muawiyah was perceived as so strong that the capital of the Byzantine Empire was moved to Syracuse, Sicily in 668 AD. They feared losing Constantinople. The capital was administered by Emperor Constance's son Constantine, but the emperor was nevertheless assassinated by one of his Greek servants during a military revolt. It goes on to say, on the other hand, in spite of its strength, there is still not a shred of primary evidence that attests to the rise of a world power that would have carried the brand Islam. This is a critical conceptual basis. At the Sixth Ecumenical Council in 680 to 681, one old man with an infantile intelligence was condemned, who promised to raise the dead. Okay. But because he could not make it happen, he was laughed at by the impatient clergyman. This mysterious figure, Polychronius, comes without face or history, but he made the extraordinary claim that Jerusalem should rule supreme over all other bishoprics, including Constantinople and Rome. This is a strange proposal, given that Islam should rule over Jerusalem at this time. So you can see there's a contradiction there in relation to the standard Islamic narrative. Now, it has profound implications not only for the origin and founding story of buildings on the Temple Mount, but also for the alleged primacy of a church organization in any city about to fall into a 1,000-year schism. His condemnation at the council cannot be emphasized enough. A Sophianid structure sits on top of the Temple Mount. Either Polychronius' proposal, an eschatological worldview, truly originated in senility, or moderns want to see something that the contemporary council could not see: Islam. Anastasius Seneta attests to large-scale construction activities on the Temple Mount under Al Malik. Around 690, he viewed the Saracen Arabs in the context of Christian heretics as Melkites, who he described as viewing Jesus as man, venerating other saints, and rejecting the idea of a begotten Son of God. It appears that Seneta describes the Umayyad strand of Proto-Islam in the Doctrina Jacobi. Several milestones between Damascus and Jerusalem, as well as temple iconography on pre-Reform coins, indicate that the Holy City and the Temple Mount were indeed part of large-scale infrastructure projects, but nothing is said about the Dome of the Rock. This is followed by the Quran's mentioning of the Sufyanid and Marwanid documents that can be circumambulated. Now, here is when it gets really interesting. From the Umayyad Codex of Sana, we have designs of a tower that appears to be accessible through an elevated platform with stairs to the left. Okay, so that's the tower there. Now, what I've done is I've taken the pictures. I'm just going to show you. This is the picture as given, and I've used editing software to fill in the gaps using a cloning tool, and hopefully we can show you that here. Okay, so it's not done brilliantly or anything like that, but there's a few of the gaps that I've filled in, and I'll continue that up so you can see it a bit better. Okay, so if you look down the bottom, you can see clearly there's steps going upwards. Okay, this is a raised platform. Okay, there are Roman arches. Well, they're not Roman arches, those ones here, sorry. I don't know what you call those, but there's lots of columns between the different floors, and there are different things hanging in the windows, as it were. And it's, as you can see, it's quite narrow and tall. Okay. Now he goes on to describe the height of it as 100 feet high. Okay, so how that would compare with objects that we're familiar with today? Well, the Eiffel Tower is 10 times that height, so it's not massively high, but high enough for the time. It would have been somewhere between 6 to 8 floors high. Okay, so significant. In terms of the width of this would be about right to be placed over the rock on top of the Temple Mount, the Abraham rock. Okay, the Sacra, as it's called. Let's go back to the paper now. So he says, We have designs of a tower that appears to be accessible through an elevated platform with stairs. Because of the centrality of the foundation stone on the Temple Mount, one is allowed to speculate whether the Dome of the Rock was the design's subject in its form at the time of the codex. It is possibly based on an octagonal shape, but more likely from an 8-pointed double square below right, since it neither looks like the one in Charlemagne's Bible that it will show later, nor the one standing today. These drawings would only help in supporting the case that the Dome of the Rock went through multiple reconstructions from the ground up. And I think you can probably guess what the implications of that would be. It would mean that the rock inscriptions that are in the Dome of the Rock did not come from Abd al Malik's time, because the Sana manuscript would be dated to Abd al Malik's time or a little bit later. So you can't have two different buildings on the same site at the same time. So I think this would rule that out. So this was there first. And what's interesting about the shape of it is it's quite phallic. I'll go into that a little bit later, give you sort of equivalence to it. But let's have a look at what he's talking about. He spoke about it being a double square. Okay, now I don't know if you can make that out, but if you imagine a square there and then another square off it, does that make sense? Two squares off center from each other. Now this is also found in the Sana manuscript or the Sana codex. Now I had to think about that. I was looking at this image and I can't imagine looking at the tower how that could fit with that, but perhaps the solution would be that at the base, the platform at the base would follow this pattern, whereas the tower is possibly circular going up. So that's one way of understanding the relationship between these two, if they are related. Now, while there's no base for a conclusion, there is something to be said about the aesthetics of the Sana's drawing. There is no Arab architectural vacuum when I look at the primary evidence of these drawings as part of this oldest Quran. Okay? No comparable is extant anywhere. The sectional view reveals a pleasing aspect ratio. Let's have a look at it again. And a lofty build with countless columned Roman arches that form multi-storied arcades with a lamp or coat of arms hanging in each opening. These details are testament for the drawing being a representation of a religiously significant monument already standing rather than one to be constructed. With 8 stories, the building is at least 100 feet tall and the drum's diameter over 50 feet. Without knowing the scale of the drawing, the wider base adds only about another 15 feet or the respective ratio thereof and seems to be around 35 feet in height. The double square ground plan is something of a surprise. Other than the identical decorative motif, the sectional drawing does not reveal whether and how they might be related, but it appears to be a foundational symbolism that replaced the double triangle of the Star of David with a Muslim double square, an 8-pointed star. That it was an intentional mutilation can be demonstrated with Jerusalem coins that were issued with an 8-pointed star rather than the customary Star of David, see below right. I've already shown that Maccabee coins used the messianic 8-pointed star as a symbol of Jewish royalty. So you can see those stars there and there. This elementary geometric design of the double square is not new though. Surprise, surprise. It can be seen in the 6th century floor mosaic of the Church of the Virgin in Jordan City, with the Madaba map. Can you see the two squares? So that's basically the design as found in the Sana. Okay, it has huge messianic significance. The ideas of the two structures on the parchment and on the Temple Mount are diametrically opposed and likely removed in time, unless, as rudimentary geometry teaches, one were to connect the 8 corners of the double square, voila, l'octagon. But it would not be a stretch to speculate that the diameter of the inner drum of the Sana's drawing would have to rely on the foundation stone's dimensions, and would therefore be near the width of the modern dome if it were to depict a structure on the Temple Mount covering the rock. This would render the old drawing's version significantly higher than its modern shape. The modern building on the Temple Mount defies the pleasing architecture. The dome of the rock appears heavy with a drum and cupola that sit too low. Despite its fatty appearance, it looks fragile rather than filigree. Exterior octagonal walls and the weight of the structure appear to want to collapse away from the foundation stone that the building covers. The height of the exterior octagonal walls is completely out of proportion. If Sana's is state-of-the-art, then the extant Dome of the Rock is a comparable Dark Age disgrace. The latter does not fit the description of a building that surpassed all previous buildings. The former does. They are hardly of the same time, let alone of the same spirit. The modern building is completely removed from the cunning courage of the Sana's architect. These drawings would not be part of this Quran if they were not to represent the author's most important religious building. With certainty, the structure is not the Kaaba in Mecca, not only because its existence is in question, but also because its cubic form is not in question. If not in Medina, which can also be excluded, then the architectural design can only have other origins, Sana or Kufa, for example. Because of the Quran's approval of the circumambulation around the Sufyanid and Marwanid structures, there is certainty that the designs are not related to the Temple Mount in Jerusalem. This primary evidence wants to tell us something important about the extant surahs in the Sana Quran. Ditch myths about Mecca in favour of what is real. Everything else is conjecture. Now, I'm confused by the paper, and I wonder, is it a mistake? Did AJ Deus mean to say there is certainty that the designs are not related to the Temple Mount in Jerusalem? I would have thought, given the logic of his argument, that actually he meant to say they are related to the Temple Mount in Jerusalem. Surely that's what he meant. I wonder, has he made a typo there? I think it's hard to imagine that he was not mentioning Jerusalem there. Now, one critical element is missing: a reliable date for the Sana Quran. Let me contribute to the related discussion with this. By nature of prophecy, there can only be a Quran from the supreme spiritual leaders from the house of Joseph, possibly in agreement with the house of Ali. From this follows that the Umayyad Quran can only exist if this lineage is from one of the two houses. Now, the lineup of primary evidence continues with the Zuqquin chronicle of the late 8th century. It makes no mention of the Dome of the Rock when referring to restoration going on in the ruins of Jerusalem. Instead, the chronicle seems to try to say that whatever may have been on the Temple Mount had not been used as a mosque until Al-Mansur. Al-Mansur was in the middle of the 8th century. The Caliph moved into the western region in order to go to Jerusalem. He wreaked havoc, turned everything topsy-turvy, terrorizing and devastating, to a degree worse than in Mesopotamia. He acted as Daniel had prophesied of the Antichrist himself. He turned the temple into a mosque because the little that had remained of Solomon's temple became a mosque for the Arabs. He repaired the ruins of Jerusalem. Is it certain that the Temple of Solomon is referring to the dome and not another building on the mount? To fixate the dome or the inscriptions onto Al Malik, this primary evidence would have to be ignored. From the understanding that something else, a temple, had been converted into a mosque, follows that there were not possibly Muslim inscriptions before said conversion. That kind of makes sense, doesn't it? Moreover, the chronicle appears to mention just a single building, not two. So that kind of rules out the idea that the Dome of the Rock was there, doesn't it? Besides, I will below show that this one building was probably situated in the north of the Temple Mount. Logic of the primary evidence commands that the Sufyanid monument to the east of the Temple Mount had been razed, while the Temple of Solomon may be the Marwanid synagogue. So what is he saying? He's saying that there was no building here, there was no building here, and there was a building here in the north that was still there, that was converted into a mosque at that time. Okay, this is the middle of the 8th century. Okay, so that would mean that if there was no Dome of the Rock, no building there, then there's no rock inscription. So even in the middle of the 8th century, there's no rock inscription. Now, from the late 8th century exists a Bible from the court school of Charlemagne that is now stored in the British Library. Right. It depicts a scene with the Annunciation of the birth of John the Baptist to Zechariah at the altar of the Temple of Jerusalem. Although only a round dome is depicted, it is believed that the intent of the designer was to show the Dome of the Rock. A similar design is found on another manuscript fragment of the court school, so we got corroboration there. So this is the late 8th century. However, the logic of both drawings points at the intention to show the holy place of Zechariah in the Haram area of the Al-Aqsa Mosque. With a lot of goodwill, it could be viewed as the inner dome of the Dome of the Rock, which may have been standing at the time of the creation of the Bible. However, that would eliminate inscriptions and mosaics that are mounted on the interior octagonal arcade. You see the problem? The current inscriptions bear a construction date of 72 AH or 691 to 2 AD and the dedication of Caliph al-Mamun, who reigned from 813 to 833. It is part of a 20-meter long text that was mounted above the arches of the interior octagonal arcade. However, the Caliph's name constitutes a repair. It is said that the Dome of the Rock was expanded under his patronage. Did al-Mamun tear a pre-existing building down to make room for a new one? How did he enlarge an octagonal building? If the Sana's drawings were its template, then it would not have been as hard as it may seem. Bronze plates that are attached to the lintels above the 4 outside doors are engraved with the year 831 AD. According to these, should they be authentic, renovations were indeed underway. We need to keep in mind that engraving was an art that was still mastered over 1,000 years later. The implication there is, there's always a danger of fraud. So, the traveller Bernard the monk visited the holy city around 870 AD. Okay, so this is 200 years, almost 200 years after Abd al Malik supposedly built the Dome of the Rock. And he wrote that the Temple of Solomon is in the north, which houses a Saracen synagogue. Okay, the Dome of the Rock is not in the north part, so why didn't he see the Dome of the Rock in 870 when he was there? And notice what he calls it: synagogue. It is remarkable that Bernard recognized the building as a synagogue. Christian monks do not usually get confused about such fundamental terminology. Moreover, he places the synagogue to the north of the platform, while the Dome of the Rock sits dead centre on the north-south axis and offset to the west. To place the rock to the north, his description requires that the entire northern half of the platform would have had to be built after his visit. Now, he says, I'm surprised about the openness of the secret, not about the fact that it was a synagogue. Academics should perhaps take his report more serious. It is primary evidence for a temple of Solomon for Saracen Jews on the Temple Mount. It was perhaps the only building up there. Together with the Zutquin Chronicle, it appears that the Temple of Solomon was indeed a synagogue in the north of the Temple Mount, and that the foundation stone may not have been covered with a major monument. Let that sink in. Before Al-Mamun, the Dome of the Rock appears to be invisible. After an alleged enlargement, there was a synagogue. Although absence of evidence is no evidence of absence, here we are not dealing with such obscure detail of fact, but with one of the most important buildings for all Judaic religions and inscriptions for Islam. No Jew took note, no Christian, no Muslim, no body, no soul. Very strange. Let's look at the next source. In the late 9th century, the Sunni historian geographer Yaqubi, who died in 897 or 8, reported in a way that is suggestive of the building having stood long enough to leave room for interpretation. Okay, so in other words, it's been built a while, but just long enough for him to claim that Abd al Malik built it. Okay, so this is a late source, but he says, we're going to read through all of it. Then Abd al Malik built above the Sacra a dome and hung around it with curtains of brocade, and he instituted doorkeepers for the same, and the people took the custom of circumambulating the rock as Sacra of Jerusalem, even as they had placed around the Kaaba at Mecca, and the usage continued thus all the days of the dynasty of the Umayyads. The inadmissible traditions of both historians, Yaqubi and Bukhari, contain passages that claim that Mecca was forbidden, or later destroyed, providing a reverse reasoning for the dome's construction. Okay. The Sufyanid rulers had long before circumambulated their building. It seems possible that the structure was not standing in the 770s or lay in ruins, and that mosaics were absent towards the end of the 9th century. Yet it is the first contemporary primary evidence that a building now covers the rock, and that the efforts in forming a communal memory was focused on attributing a structure to Al-Malik that could only have stood for a few decades at the most. So it's blatant fraud. The thing was only up for a few decades, but just long enough for them to make that suggestion and for it to stick. Now, under him, Jerusalem is renamed from the Roman Umayyad Ilya Philistine to Al-Quds, holiness, thus raising the status of the holy city after tradition moved the raised Safa and Marwa to be part of idolatrous hills down south. After him, the caliphate turns into a military state and shifts its focus to Samarra, from where the anarchy of Samarra would lead to the destabilization and decline of Abbasid power. In short, the first prototype for the Dome of the Rock was built between 870 and 1897, precisely when tradition starts to creating a new communal memory. Therefore, neither Abd al Malik's dedicatory inscription nor al-Mamun's correction could have existed before that time. In the year 903 AD, Ibn al-Faqih al-Hamadani provides for the first eyewitness account that there was a platform leading up to the Dome of the Rock. I'm going to read this one. We're talking the 10th century now. In the middle of the Haram area is a platform measuring 300 ells in length by 140 ells across, and its height is 9 ells. It has 6 flights of stairways leading up to the Dome of the Rock. The dome rises in the middle of this platform. The ground plan of the same measures 100 ells by 100. Its height is 70 ells. Its circumference is 360 ells. In the dome every night they light 300 lamps. It has 4 gates roofed over, and at each gate are 4 doors, and over each gate is a portico of marble. The stone of the rock measures 34 ells by 27 ells, and under the rock is a cavern in which the people pray. This cavern is capable of containing 62 persons. The edifice, the dome, is covered with white marble, and its roof with red gold. In its walls and high in the drum are 56 windows glazed with glass of various hues. Each measures 6 ells in the height and by 6 spans across. The dome, which was built by Abd al Malik ibn Marwan, is supported on 12 piers and 30 pillars. It consists of a dome over a dome, that is, an inner and outer, in which are sheets of lead and white marble. To the east of the Dome of the Rock stands the Dome of the Chain. It is supported by 20 marble columns, and its roof is covered with sheets of lead. Notice the Dome of the Chain makes its first appearance. In front of it, again to the east, is the praying station of Al-Khidir, St. George Alias. The platform occupies the middle of the Haram area. To the north is the Dome of the Prophet and the station of Gabriel. Near the rock is the Dome of the Ascension. Now we have a first description of the Dome of the Rock that resembles the building as it stands today in the middle of the Haram area. And again, just to emphasize, this is the 10th century. This is how long we've had to wait to get there. It does not tell us that it is octagonal. The inscriptions and mosaics are still missing, but he mentions Al-Malik. Do you see the problem? The semblance is toppled, though, in a detailed description by the Spanish Arab Ibn Abdul Rabi. He mentions 30 columns and 18 around the rock. This agrees with Al-Faqih and the extant building. So it seems like there's holes in the narrative wherever we look. Another description from 978 AD, so late 10th century, by Ibn Hokal and Ishtakbri, provides more details about the Dome of the Rock. The holy city is nearly as large as Al-Ramah. It is a city perched high on the hills. You have to go up to it from all sides. There is here a mosque, a greater than which does not exist in all Islam. The main building, supposedly the Aqsa Mosque, occupies the southeastern angle of the mosque area or noble sanctuary and covers about half the breadth of the same. The remainder of the Haram area is left free and is nowhere built over except in the part around the rock. At this place there has been raised a stone terrace, like a platform of great unhewn blocks, in the centre of which, covering the rock, is a magnificent dome. The rock itself is about breast high above the ground, its length and breadth being almost equal, that is to say some 10 cells and odd by the same across. You may descend below it by steps, as though going down to a cellar, passing through a door measuring some 5 cells by 10. The chamber below the rock is neither square nor round, and is above a man's stature and height. Okay, and that's You can see down there, that's where he's positioning the Al-Aqsa Mosque. Okay, so he places in the southeastern angle of the Temple Mount. Okay, the building was standing on top of its platform. While the Dome of the Rock would sit at its current place, the mosque was much larger, the greatest in the world, than the current Al-Aqsa Mosque. See, the current one is just to the left of it there in the map. So if you just, so this is the current site. This is where it had been. Give you an idea of the size it was originally. Its centre line would have been completely off from an orientation towards the foundation stone. Okay. As I will show, the structure fell victim to changes during the Crusader years. The Sufyanid, ex-Umar and Marwanid buildings near the eastern and northern walls have by now disappeared. Okay, so there and there, they would have gone. All that could be left from the large mosque could be remnants of its western wall that could have been incorporated into the modern structure of the Al-Aqsa Mosque, if anything. So most of it was raised. Okay. The Al-Aqsa Mosque that we have today is not on the same site as the original one. So that's an important point. Now, but still, there's neither information about mosaics nor the unusual octagonal shape of the building. Okay. There's also no attribution to Abd al Malik, and the notion of earlier builders would persist. The first report outside of earlier tradition that claims al-Malik's involvement emerges with the late 10th century geographer al-Muqtazi. He says the Al-Aqsa Mosque lies in the southeastern corner of the Holy City. The stones of its foundation, which were laid by David, are 10 ells or a little less in length. On these, the Caliph Abd al Malik subsequently built using smaller but well-shaped stones, and battlements are added above. Key bit here. The mosque is even more beautiful than that of Damascus, for during the building of it, they had for a rival and as a comparison the great church belonging to the Christians at Jerusalem, and they built this to be even more magnificent than the other. But in the days of the Abbasids occurred the earthquakes, which threw down most of the main building, all in fact except that portion around the mihrab. The edifice rose firmer and more substantial than ever it had been in former times. The more ancient portion remained, even like a beauty spot in the midst of the new. The main building on the mount had almost entirely been destroyed to its foundations in the mid-9th century. You see that? Likewise, the Dome of the Rock could not have escaped substantial damage. In later descriptions, he appears to treat the building as though it were an integral part of an ongoing major construction project. His bickering over Jewish and Christian control of the affairs of Jerusalem are noteworthy. Now, what's interesting here, al-Muqtadi's description of the Al-Aqsa Mosque details mosaics, doors, and other ornaments. In describing the Mosque of Damascus, he compares Al-Aqsa with the Great Church, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, which he calls the Kumama, the dunghill. Isn't that interesting? Intended to smear Islam's competition. Now, we saw an inscription, or we heard about an inscription of that was taken of the black stone in Mecca back in the 19th century, and it refers to the dunghill, but in relation to the Temple Mount. So it's interesting that the Muslims have transferred that from the Temple Mount towards the Holy Sepulchre at this stage. In the context of Damascus, he notes about the Kumama. Caliph Abd al Malik, noting the greatness of the dome of the Kumama and its significance, was moved lest it should dazzle the minds of the Muslims, and hence erected above the rock the dome which now is seen there. There is no doubt that al-Muqaddasi saw the dome of the rock. So here it goes. In the center of the platform is the dome of the rock, which rises above an octagonal building. Okay, so now we got the octagonal building, having 4 gates, one opposite to each of the flights of steps leading up from the court. All these are adorned with gold, and closing each of them is a beautiful door of cedar wood, finely worked in pattern. These last were sent by command of the mother of the Caliph al-Muqtadir, Bala, 908 to 932 AD, it's 10th century. In each of the gates is a balustrade of marble and cedar wood with brasswork without, and in the railing likewise are gates, but these are unornamented. Okay. Finally, the Dome of the Rock is undoubtedly an octagonal building. Why then would he compare it with the Holy Sepulchre, if not because of preconceived information about a no longer existing building that he already had? Renovations at the dome seem to have been underfoot at the beginning of the 10th century. In 1019, so we're 1019, 1020 AD, or the 11th century now, Al-Wasiti, the preacher of the Al-Aqsa Mosque on the Temple Mount, produces a detailed account of Al-Malik's involvement. When Abd al Malik wanted to build the Dome of the Rock, he came from Damascus to Jerusalem. He then sent to all his deputies in all of his dominions. He wrote Abd al Malik plans to build a dome over the rock to shelter the Muslims from cold and heat and to construct a masjid. But before he starts, he wants to know his subjects' opinion. With their approval, the deputies wrote back, "May God permit the completion of this enterprise, and may he count the building of the dome and the masjid a good deed for Abd al Malik and his predecessors." He then gathered craftsmen from all his dominions and asked them to provide him with the description and form of the planned dome above before he engaged in its construction. So it was marked for him in the san of the masjid. He then ordered the building of the treasury to the east of the rock, which is on the edge of the rock, and filled it with money. He then appointed Raja ibn Jaweh and Yazid ibn Salam as supervisors and ordered them to spend generously on its construction. He then returned to Damascus. When the two men satisfactorily completed the building, they wrote to Abd al Malik to inform him that they had completed the construction of his dome and the Aqsa Mosque. They ended their letter with the expression, "There's nothing in the building that leaves room for criticism." They informed him that the sum of 100,000 dinars was left from the money he allocated. He offered to them as a reward, but they declined, indicating that they had already been generously compensated. Abd al Malik then ordered that the gold coins be melted and cast on the exterior of the dome, which then so glittered that no one could look straight into it. Centuries after the fact, we were handed names of architects. Receiving the approval of al-Malik's subjects, a perfect building was erected that no Muslim could have explained, one so beautiful that it could not be improved upon. The dome that was previously covered in red gold is now cast in al-Malik's gold coins. There is no need to pretend that this is anything other than a fairy tale. Suddenly, evidence surfaces that is so spurious and self-congratulatory that it leaves no doubt that it is either never existed or was backdated. His account bears no credibility whatsoever. The oral chain of transmission that spans over 300 years is just as spurious as the text itself. Attempts to rationalize that al-Wasiti's account is corroborated by the inscriptions is ludicrous. His text reveals that there was no dedicatory inscription at this time, manipulated by al-Mamun or not. He would otherwise undoubtedly have noted its falsehood. He also does not talk about other features, in particular the function of the stone that is covered by the building or the circumambulation around it. He does not mention them because these functions were moved to Mecca and are no longer visible in al-Wasiti's Jerusalem. Why would he lie? His job is about things that do not exist. He dedicated his life to them. Now, going to move on. Evidence of absence for mosaics and inscriptions. No evidence of absence needs to be presented for mosaics and inscriptions in a building that does not exist. Al-Muqaddasi continues in describing all the details of the Dome of Rock, even those without ornaments. Before getting to his report, I would like to present how Al-Muqaddasi describes mosaics of the Umayyad Mosque of Damascus in a side note on the margins of one of his manuscripts. So here it is. He says, mosaic is composed of morsels of glass such as are used for the standard coin weights, but they are yellow in colour or grey, black, red, mottled, or else gilt, by laying gold on the surface, which is then covered by a thin sheet of glass. They prepare plaster with Arabian gum and lay it over the walls. This the ornament with the mosaics, which are set so as to form figures and inscriptions. In some cases they cover the whole surface with the gold mosaic, so that all the walls seem as though it were built by nothing but pure gold. His interest in these details tell us that it is not likely that he would miss mentioning mosaics and inscriptions, in particular if they are of outstanding workmanship like the ones inside the Dome of the Rock. Here's what he says about the Dome of the Rock. The dome externally is completely covered with brass plates, gilt, while the building itself, its floor, its walls, and the drum, both within and without, are ornamented with marble and mosaics, after the manner that we have already described when speaking of the Mosque of Damascus. The cupola of the dome is built in 3 sections. I won't go through all the rest of it, but he basically doesn't make any reference to the inscriptions. The workmen did not seem to have taken note of inscriptions. Neither did Al-Muqaddasi, who otherwise described Jerusalem as a city dominated by Christians and Jews. Al-Muqaddasi never failed to mock Christians. In one passage in the text, he marvels at a talisman that is inscribed with Muhammad is Allah's apostle, and again in the name of Allah, the merciful, the compassionate, but not the inscriptions. At this time, the dispute over the origin of the building was by no means settled. The Fatimid geographer Muhallabi, who died in 990 AD, asserted that Al-Walid I had built the Dome of the Rock as a monument for the Last Judgment. So they can't even get who built it correct, even when they're making it up. If there would have been a dedication, his error would have been apparent. But there's another thing. How could he get that mixed up? If there's meant to have been a dedication there, he couldn't have got that wrong. Before him, Eutychius did likewise, adding that the dome was moved to the Temple Mount from a church in Baalbek. Geographers and historians seem not to have noticed mosaics or inscriptions, and if they would have seen them, then they should have been, after the manner that we have already described when speaking of the Mosque of Damascus, an entirely different style. Instead, they mention paintings and a chain hanging from the Dome of the Rock. In 1019, Al-Wasiti is again transmitting older traditions. During the time of Abd al Malik, there was hanging on the chain above the rock, under the dome, the Yatimi pearl, the horns of Abraham's ram, and the crown of Hisra, which we Khosrow. When the Benu Hassim, the Abbasids, took over the caliphate, they sent them to the Kaaba. Despite their importance, neither reality nor tradition knows anything about inscriptions in this building. Again, al-Wasiti is specific. He may even have seen veneration objects hanging from the Kaaba in Mecca, but just because there may have been such gifts hanging from a chain in Mecca does not corroborate their presence in Jerusalem. Just because the Yatima pearl is corroborated does not place it inside the Dome of the Rock. Instead, al-Wasiti is telling us that nothing was hanging from the dome in his time of preaching in the Al-Aqsa Mosque. Of course, he misses the mosaics and the inscriptions for a simple reason: they were absent. And that's where we leave it. Okay, so leave your thoughts and comments below. That was a lot to take in, but I think his case is pretty strong. There does seem to be a case for the idea that the Dome of the Rock was a late build, and that the rock inscriptions were also late. So, which kind of would make logical sense. I'm going to leave you with, we started by looking at the original tower that was on the Dome of the Rock, and I had a look to see what would be the nearest thing to it in today's world, and I think it would be this, the Blue Origin rocket. This would be about 75 feet high, whereas the one on that existed before the Dome of the Rock would have been about 25% higher. It would have been 100 feet high, sort of similar shape. And I couldn't help but consider that it was a very phallic shape to have begun, and maybe that was part of the reason why they got rid of it. I also couldn't help noticing that on Abd al Malik's coin there is that staff that, well, the AJ Deus calls a staff, but perhaps is this the tower? Maybe it's just an idea. This is my little suggestion. Maybe that's what it is, but I think the Moses staff is probably more accurate, but it does seem remarkably similar in terms of shape to that tower, and perhaps we could imagine people wandering around. Also, the conjoined P and the I, which stands for the kind of the Byzantine mark. It's interesting that they're there as well, because do they indicate, perhaps, and this is very speculative, could they indicate the other two monuments that were on the Temple Mount that the Quran was referring to as Safa and Marwa? Could they symbolically have represented that? So is there a hidden message there? So that's it for today. Hope you found that interesting. A lot of details to take in. Talk to you all very soon. Bye-bye.